All right, so get this. You've given us this software requirements spec from way back in 2010
Oh, wow.
for a system
Huh?
to manage drug registration in Russia.
Interesting.
I know what you're thinking, right, Dora? Sounds riveting.
Yeah.
But stick with me here. This isn't just some boring old document.
Okay.
It's a real portal to the past.
Yeah.
We got to play detective and put together what the Russian pharmaceutical world was like, over a decade ago.
Exactly. Like a little time capsule.
Yeah.
Full of clues about how things used to work.
All right, so let's set the scene a little bit.
Okay.
18-page document,
Wow.
version 1.0, draft 2, dated June 28, 2010.
All right.
The title.
Yeah.
Software Requirements for the Drug Registration Management System.
Okay.
Not exactly going to be a bestseller with that title.
Right.
But the stuff inside.
Yeah.
Oh, that's where it gets interesting.
Okay.
So this was made for the Russian branch of Fresenius Kabi, global healthcare company. And it basically describes the software that they wanted to replace their existing system with.
Gotcha.
For managing drug registration.
Okay.
Now, from what we can tell, their old system was probably a bunch of spreadsheets.
Right.
And manual processes.
Ooh, I can only imagine the headache.
Could you imagine?
Yeah.
This new system was supposed to streamline everything, bring it all together digitally. So picture this, you're a registrar back in 2010.
Yeah.
Just drowning in paperwork, trying to keep track of every little thing for every drug in the pipeline.
Right.
Well, that's where the system comes in.
Okay.
It was made to track tons of data points for every drug.
Like what?
Everything.
Yeah.
The name, the category, the dosage, the packaging, all the scientific data you could think of.
Wow, that's a lot of information.
But here's something interesting.
What's that?
The document also talks about managing notes.
Notes.
Alongside all this structured data.
Oh, okay.
So this tells me that, even way back then, they realized that human insights were just as important as the hard data.
Right.
It wasn't just about automating the process. It was about helping the people behind it, too.
I like that.
Yeah, that's a really good point.
Yeah. It wasn't just,
It's not just,
numbers and figures.
Exactly. There was a human element to it.
Yeah, for sure.
Now, obviously, a system like this needs users, right?
Of course.
This document actually outlines 5 different roles.
5.
It's like a cast of characters in our little pharmaceutical play here.
I like it.
We've got the branch manager,
Okay.
the manager,
All right.
the registrar, the system administrator,
Okay.
and then we have the guest.
The guest.
Yeah.
That's interesting.
Each of these roles had specific things they needed to do.
Okay.
And it kind of gives us a picture of how drug registration worked back then.
Yeah, I see that.
So let's break it down a little.
All right.
Branch manager needed reports on timelines, budgets, explanations for any delays. This wasn't just about keeping things on schedule, though, right?
Right.
This shows that delays were probably a pretty common headache back then.
Yeah.
Maybe even a symptom of something bigger going on within the Russian drug registration system.
Oh, that's a good point. It's easy to overlook those little hints.
Yeah.
But they often tell us so much about the challenges and the priorities.
There's the time.
Exactly.
Then we have the registrar,
Okay.
the person actually doing the work,
Yeah.
updating the system with the progress for each step of the process.
They were the ones in the thick of it.
They were in the trenches.
Yeah.
And then let's not forget about the system administrator, right?
Of course not.
Keeping this whole digital operation running.
Right. Keeping the ship afloat.
And then there's the guest.
The guest. Yeah, that's a weird one.
It's a head scratcher.
Right. Who is this?
They could only see certain things in the system,
Oh, so limited access?
mainly just for viewing information.
Okay.
Makes you wonder who they were and what they were doing in the process.
Right. Were they like auditors or regulators?
Maybe even potential investors getting a sneak peek.
Oh, that's interesting.
It's a little mystery inside a bigger story.
Yeah, I like it.
But we'll get to that a little later.
Okay.
For now, let's focus on the main event,
All right.
the drug registration process.
The nitty gritty.
The document outlines 4 main phases.
Okay.
Initiation, dossier preparation,
All right.
expertise,
Okay.
and obtaining registration documents.
Oh, it's a mouthful.
It's fascinating to see how they wanted the system to be involved in each of these phases.
Yeah.
From managing deadlines
Right.
to keeping track of costs and documenting every little step.
Really thorough.
It shows how meticulous they were about every single detail.
Yeah, even in this early draft.
Yeah, they were trying to create like Fort Knox
Right?
for drug registration,
Yeah,
making sure every piece of information was totally secure and tracked.
absolutely.
But even with a system like this, things didn't always go as planned, right?
Right. I imagine there were some hiccups.
Yeah, you're right.
Yeah.
One thing that really stood out to me was the requirement for the system to keep track of potential delays.
Oh, really?
And even ask the user for a reason.
Interesting.
Clearly, delays were happening enough that they built in a specific way to deal with them.
That makes sense.
Makes you wonder what those common reasons were.
Yeah, like what were the usual suspects?
Were they bureaucratic hurdles,
Uh-huh.
lack of resources,
Right.
or something else entirely?
Right.
The document doesn't say.
Correct.
It just says to be defined.
Oh, so it's a mystery.
Yeah, a little clue that leads to a dead end
For now.
for now.
Okay.
But it definitely adds another layer to our investigation.
It does.
Speaking of clues, let's not forget about Appendix A.
All right.
It outlines the data model for the system.
Okay.
And it's actually pretty advanced for 2010.
Wow.
They really thought carefully about how to organize information about these drugs. They even included fields for both scientific data and administrative details.
So not just what the drug is,
Yeah,
but also how it's managed within the system.
exactly.
That's pretty impressive for the time.
Yeah, a really sophisticated way to manage data back then.
Yeah.
Shows how important technology and data were becoming in the pharmaceutical world.
Even back then.
Even back then,
Yeah.
this system was in many ways ahead of its time.
Yeah, that's true.
But there are also parts that show the limits of technology back then.
Oh, really? Like what? Tell me more.
If you look at the non-functional requirements in Section 5,
Okay.
they say that the system should respond in under 3 seconds
All right.
and support at least 20 users at the same time.
20.
Yeah.
That doesn't seem like a lot.
Now, those numbers might sound tiny today.
Yeah, compared to what we're used to.
Right.
Yeah.
But remember, this was 2010.
Oh, that's true.
Easy to judge based on what we have now.
Yeah, we take it for granted.
But back then, this was probably cutting edge.
Yep.
Good reminder that advanced is always changing
Right. Always evolving.
based on the technology we have.
Exactly.
And these limitations actually give us some insight
Into what?
into the state of IT in Russia back then.
Oh, interesting. Okay.
It probably reflects the hardware they had,
Yeah.
the software, the internet speeds even.
Right. All of that.
Makes you wonder how those limitations affected the development of the system
Yeah.
and even the people who used it every day.
Right. Can you imagine waiting 3 seconds for a page to load?
Yeah, it would drive us crazy.
Yeah, but for them, it was probably a huge improvement
Probably.
over whatever they were using before.
Right. It's all about perspective.
It is.
But let's move beyond just the technical stuff.
Okay.
One thing that really stands out is this focus on budgets and timelines.
Oh, yeah.
They go into so much detail
Yeah.
about tracking costs and reporting.
They were really serious about it.
Remember how the branch manager needed those reports about budget issues?
Uh-huh.
It was like every single ruble was under a microscope.
Right.
It suggests that the Russian pharmaceutical industry was really careful with money.
Right.
Maybe because of the economy back then, or maybe it was just how they did things.
Yeah, it's hard to know for sure.
Makes you wonder if those money worries affected the drugs being registered.
Yeah.
Were they choosing cheaper medications?
Interesting.
Or focusing on treatments for the most common health problems?
That's a good question.
This document doesn't really tell us,
It doesn't.
but it definitely makes you think.
Yeah. What were the big health concerns in Russia back then?
Exactly.
And did money play a role in shaping what drugs were available?
It's a good point.
This document gives us some pieces of the puzzle.
Yeah.
Now we need to see what other connections we can make.
It's like historical detective work.
I love it.
One thing I found fascinating was the structure of the document itself.
Oh, really?
I mean, for a draft version,
Yes.
it's incredibly detailed.
Wow.
The way they break down the process,
Uh-huh.
the data model,
Yeah.
even the potential reasons for delays, it shows they were really systematic
Yeah.
and organized.
Taking a really structured approach.
Yeah, a very meticulous approach to software development.
You don't see that often.
Even today, clear documentation is something we struggle with.
Oh, absolutely.
In a way, they were ahead of the curve.
I agree. They were laying a strong foundation.
It's like they wanted to make sure everyone was on the same page.
Right.
From the developers building the system to the managers overseeing it.
Yeah. And the registrar is using it every day.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And that level of detail probably helped avoid mistakes down the line
Yeah, right.
and miscommunications.
Yeah. It saves a lot of headaches in the long run.
So we've talked about how the system works,
Uh-huh.
the different roles,
Yeah.
the challenges back then,
Right.
and even how important it was to have good documentation.
Yeah.
But let's zoom out for a second.
Okay.
Think about the bigger picture.
The big picture.
What does all this tell us about the state of the Russian pharmaceutical industry in 2010?
That's a good question.
What do you think?
Well, if we put all the pieces together, we can see a pretty interesting picture.
Okay.
Looks like they were dealing with a lot of complexity,
Yeah.
bureaucracy, financial pressures,
Yeah.
and maybe even a sense of urgency to modernize.
Catch up with the rest of the world.
Yeah, exactly.
Like they were at a crossroads,
Right.
embracing technology as a way to solve those problems and make things more efficient.
Right. They saw the potential.
Yeah. But even with that push for modernization, they were still working within the limits of their time.
Absolutely. The technology available then was a lot different than what we have now.
Exactly.
It's really interesting to see how they worked around those limitations.
So they were in transition,
They were.
dealing with those constraints, but also trying to be innovative with data and automating their processes.
Makes you wonder what they would think if they could see how the industry works today.
Yeah.
Like, imagine the conversations we could have.
I know.
Comparing their vision from 2010 to the reality now.
It would be like time travel.
That would be amazing.
Okay, before we get lost in time travel fantasies,
Right.
let's get back to one thing we've been kind of avoiding.
What's that?
Those mysterious guest users.
Oh, yeah. The mystery continues.
We know they had limited access,
Yeah, mainly for viewing information.
but the document doesn't say anything more about what they did.
Right. It's so vague.
It's like they dropped this little bombshell
Mm-hmm.
and then just left us hanging.
It really makes you curious.
It does.
Yeah, who were these guests?
Right.
What kind of information did they have access to?
Exactly.
And what does their inclusion tell us about how transparent the Russian pharmaceutical industry was back then?
It's a real detective story.
It is.
So put on your detective hats.
Okay, I'm ready.
Who do you think these guests might have been?
Let me think.
All right.
Well, my first guess would be auditors
Okay.
or regulatory officials,
Uh-huh.
people who needed to check up on things,
Yeah.
make sure everything was being done by the book,
Right.
but didn't really need to manage the data themselves.
That makes sense.
Drug registration is super regulated,
Yeah.
so it would make sense to have some outside oversight built into the system.
Makes sense.
Or maybe they were from partner organizations
Okay.
or even potential investors.
Interesting.
Think about it. You're a pharmaceutical company back then,
Huh?
trying to get funding or team up with someone.
Right.
Having a system like this,
Yeah.
where you can give limited access to certain people,
Uh-huh.
that could have been a big selling point.
Like a sign of good faith,
Exactly.
showing you're transparent and efficient.
Right.
But then again, it makes you think about data security and confidentiality, too.
Oh, yeah. Good point.
Who could see what?
Uh-huh.
How do they make sure these guests didn't go snooping around where they shouldn't?
Right.
It reminds us that data security was a thing even back in 2010.
Yeah, and it's only gotten more important since then.
Oh, for sure.
It makes you think how they dealt with those problems.
Yeah. With the technology they had at the time.
Right, like another piece of the puzzle.
Yeah.
Now, before we wrap up this little investigation, there's one more thing I wanted to talk about.
All right.
Something I noticed in Appendix B.
What's that?
The one that lists the different stages a drug goes through during registration,
Oh, yeah.
from the initial application to the final approval
Uh-huh.
or rejection. And one of the states they list is registration expired.
Interesting.
That's a little detail, but it really made me think.
About what?
It means that even back then, they knew drug registrations weren't forever.
Right.
They had an expiration date.
Makes sense.
It shows how drug regulation is always ongoing.
Yeah.
It's not a one-time thing.
It's constant monitoring, reassessment, renewal.
Exactly.
Got to make sure those medications are safe and effective over time.
Makes you wonder, what happened when a registration actually expired?
Yeah.
Did they just pull the drugs off the market? Was there a grace period?
Right.
Or did everyone scramble to renew it?
Interesting.
The document doesn't really say,
Figures.
but I'm sure they had some procedure for dealing with it.
Yeah. Most likely either renewing or discontinuing the drug.
It reminds us that even in 2010, the pharmaceutical world was constantly changing.
Right.
Regulations changed, science advanced, and the industry had to keep up.
It's always a balancing act,
Yeah.
maintaining safety and effectiveness,
Mhm.
but also encouraging innovation
Right.
and keeping pace with the latest discoveries.
So what seemed like just a boring old software document
Yeah.
turned into this amazing trip through time.
I know, right?
We've found clues about the drug registration process,
Yeah.
the different roles,
Okay.
the technology back then,
The economic pressures.
even the mystery of those guests.
I still can't get over that one.
Amazing what you can learn from one document.
It is.
It shows that history is all around us. just waiting to be discovered.
Exactly. We just have to look for it.
Now it's time to step out of our time machine.
Back to the present.
Two before we go.
I want to leave you with one last thought.
All right.
As you deal with all the complexities of our pharmaceutical world today, take a minute to think about how much has changed since 2010.
That's a good point.
And maybe even more importantly,
what's that?
What stayed the same?
Right.
The challenges.
Yeah.
The priorities, the ethical questions.
It's all still relevant today.
These are all things that still shape the industry today.
Absolutely.
Thanks for joining us on this deep dive.
Well, I'm thinking maybe they were auditors or, like you said, regulatory officials, people who needed to kind of check in on the process, make sure everything was on the up and up.
Exactly.
But they didn't really need to, actively manage any data.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense.
Drug registration is super heavily regulated, right?
Oh, yeah.
So it would make sense to have some kind of, outside oversight built in.
Right. Or maybe they were from partner organizations.
Oh, interesting.
Or even potential investors.
Oh.
Like, imagine you're a pharmaceutical company back then.
Yeah.
And you're trying to secure funding or collaborate with someone. Being able to show them a system like this, where you can give them limited access, it can be a real selling point.
Absolutely.
Showing you're committed to transparency and efficiency.
Exactly.
But then again, it also raises some questions about data security.
Oh, for sure.
And confidentiality. Who gets to see what information?
Right.
And how do you make sure these guests don't overstep their boundaries?
Right. Good point.
It's a good reminder that even back in 2010, data security was a concern.
Oh, yeah, absolutely.
And it's only become more complex since then.
It really has.
It makes you wonder how they tackled those challenges.
Yeah.
With the technology they had available back then.
For sure.
It's like a whole other layer to this mystery.
It is. It's fascinating.
Now, before we completely wrap up our investigation here, there's one last detail I wanted to mention.
What is it?
Something that caught my eye in Appendix B.
Appendix B.
The one that outlines the different stages a drug can go through.
Oh, yeah. Okay.
During the registration process.
Right. From initial application to final approval.
Exactly. Or rejection.
Or rejection, yeah.
And one of the states they list is registration expired.
Oh, interesting.
It's a small thing, but it really got me thinking.
About what?
It means that even back then, they understood that drug registrations weren't permanent.
Yeah. They don't last forever.
They had a life cycle, an expiration date.
Makes sense.
It highlights how drug regulation is an ongoing thing.
It is.
It's not just a one-time check.
It's constant monitoring, reassessment, renewal,
exactly,
and making sure that medications stay safe and effective over time.
It makes you wonder what happened when a registration actually expired.
Yeah. Did they pull the drug off the market immediately?
Right. Was there some kind of grace period?
Or a mad dash to renew it?
The document doesn't really go into those specifics.
Oh, of course not.
But I'm sure there were procedures in place
to
handle those expirations.
Probably either renewing or discontinuing the drug?
Yeah, most likely. It's a reminder that even back then, the pharmaceutical world was always changing.
Always evolving?
Regulations were updated, new scientific discoveries were made, and the industry had to adapt.
It's a balancing act.
Yeah.
Keeping everything safe and effective, but also encouraging innovation and keeping up with the latest advancements.
So we started with what seemed like a pretty boring software requirements document.
Yeah. Who would have thought?
And we ended up on this fascinating journey through time.
It's amazing what you can find.
We uncovered clues about the drug registration process, the roles of the people involved, the technology they were using,
the challenges they faced,
even those mysterious guest users.
I still want to know who they were.
It really shows you how much you can learn from just one document.
It really does. It's a reminder that history is all around us.
Exactly. Sometimes it's hiding in plain sight.
We just have to know where to look.
Yeah. Well, it's time for us to step out of our time machine now.
Back to the present.
But before we go, I want to leave you with one final thought.
Okay.
As you navigate the complexities of today's pharmaceutical world, think about how much has changed since 2010.
That's a good point.
And maybe even more importantly, what stayed the same.
Right.
The challenges, the priorities, the ethical considerations. These are all enduring themes that continue to shape the industry today.
They do. It's fascinating to see how things have evolved.
Thanks for joining us on this deep dive.
It was a pleasure.